There are three plans. The first one came about a year ago, the CARES Act, and it had the big concern then, of course, was getting kids devices and getting Wi-Fi and getting schools ready to reopen. That had 13.2 billion for K-12 schools. There's also concern, as there always is, that there's going to be big budget cuts, and the Congress wanted to stabilize the schools. The next package came in December 2020. It doesn't have a cool name like CARES. Its initials sort of are pronounced SRSA, but a lot of people will call it ESSER too, because ESSER is the money that goes for elementary, secondary school emergency relief. And that had 54 billion for K-12 schools. And then, of course, came the American Rescue Plan in March, and that's got I've got the number 126 million, but that includes money that goes to private schools. For public schools, it's about 123 billion. To give you a sense of perspective, in a typical year, 2019, 2019-20 budget had 16 million for Title I for 1 year. This is going to be like over the next 3 years, like 190 billion for schools to spend, and most of it flows through the Title I formula, which benefits schools with concentrated poverty. This slide looks at just the perspective of how much per student we're getting, and it's almost 10 times as much with the American Rescue Plan as you would get in a typical year. And the CARES Act, a lot of that money has been spent. It went out about this time last year. And we have until September 22 to obligate it. The SRSA ESSER 2, that money just started arriving in the last month or two in school districts, and schools have until September 2023 to spend it. The American Rescue Plan just approved in March. Some districts have their money, some don't yet. It's all 2/3 of it's at the states, but that money will be arriving shortly at the school district level if it hasn't already. So there will be a lot more money than usual to spend. And even beyond this ESSER fund, which, as I said, is meant to stabilize schools, there's a lot more money for education tucked into the budget or into the American Rescue Plan. There's 10 billion for testing and screening, 3 billion for kids with disabilities, and there's 1 billion to expand national service programs, which is AmeriCorps workers. And these can really be force multipliers because these are short-term workers. You can use them in schools for contract tracing or for tutoring. You can use them in nonprofit organizations too. So that's sort of a hidden secret weapon that this bill provides. There's 800 million to support homeless children, and 200 million of that is already out on the street trying to find. A lot of these homeless kids are the ones who are missing so much school or aren't even enrolled. So there's a big effort right now to try to find these kids. Then there's issues. There's a big push within this bill to expand Medicaid to the states that haven't expanded it yet. This has an indirect impact on schools. The more kids you have in, the more you expand Medicaid and get parents insured, their children tend to follow. Insured kids with health coverage are healthier students and better students, plus schools can bill for Medicaid reimbursement. So there's a lot of ways that the American Rescue Plan is designed to cut child poverty in half, and anything that cuts child poverty is good for schools, because poverty and all its tangle of problems that come with it really pull down student attendance. So what can you use the money for? Most of you all probably know this, but just my analysis is almost everything you can use the bill for. I like the number 2 one, providing resources principals need to address coronavirus. There's a lot you can do with that. In terms of equity related things, the addressing learning loss with evidence-based interventions, that's a very big issue for equity. Providing services to support student mental health. This is going to be a real challenging year for children. It is this year, and coming back to school next year is going to be a big challenge. Even repairing school facilities and ventilation systems. We know that the most disinvested communities often have the most rundown schools. They've got mold, they've got issues that affect kids with asthma and teachers with asthma. They maybe have poor heating and air conditioning. So this is the bill specifically provides money for ventilation improvements. The CDC includes that as a major mitigation factor for this airborne virus. So this is a real opportunity to address some of these long deferred maintenance issues. So where is the money and how does it flow? It was approved by Congress March. This is the American Rescue Plan, but the other money sort of follows the same pattern. So approved by Congress March 10, 2/3 of it was sent to the states on March 24th. But the education department said, if you want the final third, we're not giving it to you until you submit a plan. States submit a plan to tell us how you're going to use the money. And those plans have to be submitted June 7th. Now, states can keep 10% of the money for themselves. So the states have to address that. But the same rule from the education department that demands these plans also calls on states to approve local plan, or for local governments to submit their plans to the state. I'm not quite sure how the approval process will work. That'll probably change. But in both the development of state plans and local plans, there is a requirement for community engagement and input. Parents, teachers, the broader community, students, they want to hear everybody's voices, and they need to show the education department that they have done this. So, and as I said, 90% of the money goes to LEAs, which is, local school districts, or if you have charter schools, they're often their own LEA. And so they will be getting money that way. So in terms of what the bill does, this is the American Rescue Plan, what it does for equity. And this, in both this and the December package, spells out how these efforts need to address the disproportionate impact of COVID on all these disadvantaged students. And that includes, racial and ethnic minorities and poor kids, kids with disabilities, English learners. The whole list is here. And in state plans, they have a template for what the state plan should look like. And it has a grid, and the state has to document the highest priority need for each one of these subgroups. So what is it that children with disabilities need? What is it with homeless kids need? And they need to spell that out, which means they need to think about it, which is good. There's also there's a maintenance, there's two provisions. One is called maintenance of effort, which you all probably know a bit about, but that's basically, and that's in all three of the pieces of legislation, that basically calls for school districts and states and local governments can't say, hey, now that I've got all this federal money, I'm just going to take my local money out. They need to maintain a certain level of funding. Maintenance of equity is a little more complicated, but it's basically, you can't shortchange high need schools. And there needs to be a demonstration that you're not taking money away from high need schools and giving it to lower need schools. There's still a lot of questions about that, and they haven't put out guidance about how to interpret that, but that's something to watch for. But what it means is that all your school districts and all your states have got to be thinking about equity as they approach spending this money. So who's making decisions? As the local school boards will play a big role, because much of the money is going to them. And some of them, I have a little Google alert for ESSER, and I see every day school districts making decisions about how they're going to spend the money. And that's mostly the round 2 money, that December package. And the round 3 money, the American Rescue Plan money, is just arriving. As Mariana was saying, that there are some places that are developing commissions or committees to make these decisions, both at the local school board level, and if there's a commission of some sort, those are great places for advocates to get their input in. Then, as I said, the State Board of Education, they're going to be able to preserve 10% of the money. and they will have to develop the statewide plans. So they will probably have hearings or comments or some sort of input process. That's something to watch for and see how you can interject your insights and priorities. State legislatures in some states, like in Washington state, the state legislature is washing all the money through the legislature, and then they're sending it out to the district, and they're putting some requirements on how it should be spent. So that's depending on your state, you should watch for that. And the governors have some say, obviously in the state level, but in the first 2 rounds, there was discretionary money for K-12 and higher education. The third round, all that discretionary money is for private schools. So it probably doesn't impact you as much, but the governors will have a say. So these are all levers of power. And one thing I didn't say earlier is that in this third round of funding, there's a really big priority on learning loss. We all have read about how kids have fallen behind, they've missed all this instructional time. The Affordable Care Act, the American Rescue Plan says that 20% of the money that local government spends has to go for evidence-based practices for learning loss. And evidence-based practices has a particular meaning in the federal system, which is having some sort of research to back it up. And then 5% of what states spend also has to go for evidence-based practices, and 1% of what states spend has to go for summer learning, and 1% for extended day programs. So those are all things that you're going to see spending on. And these are all things that have the potential to provide a more equitable education for the students who've been hit hardest by the pandemic and those that often are left underserved. So this is a really big opportunity. Here's a few things. This first link here, and I can make these slides available to you all later, but the first link is a piece I was telling you about, which I've been updating since April 2020, but it just has a summary of what these different provisions are. It has tables that show how much each state will receive in funding, and a lot of explanation of some of this stuff I said. The state template plan is what the Education Department put out a couple of weeks ago. And it is basically a template for states to fill out. It has things like they have to fill out a table about how many kids are in remote learning versus in person. And they have to fill out the table I was telling you about what are the highest needs for these disadvantaged kids. And they have to fill out a table about teacher shortages. So that will be a font of information. They're due June 7th, and the Education Department is going to put them up on a public website. So we're really looking forward to seeing what's there. The last 2 items are blog posts I've worked on recently. One is about summer programs and what are, and our think tank is very research oriented. So when we write something, we're like, well, what's the research show? And what the research shows on summer learning is that it helps to have a lot of fun involved in your program, not just make it sitting in a classroom. And then ventilation, I talked about a little earlier, but there really are studies that show that better heating, better air conditioning, cleaner air in the classroom leads to better outcomes for kids. So anyway, that's it for my slides. Are we going to do questions now?
Yeah, we're going to take a few questions now, Phyllis. Thank you so much for your presentation. And who knew cleaner air would be better for students? Like, it's all so much. Let's get some important things out of the way. The slides will be shared after the program. So I know some of you want to get access to these links and other important information, so it will be shared. I'm going to move to Beth Glenn's question. And I would like you to elaborate on the use for planning for school closures. Does that refer to closures for pandemic outbreaks or school closures as we previously understood it?
Well, when this, and with the first bill, the first piece of legislation that came out was March 2020. And that's when we were closing a lot of schools. They keep adding on different allowable uses. So that one has stayed. But I do think there is a recognition that this is a volatile virus, that where we're feeling pretty good right now, and a lot of adults especially are vaccinated, something could turn on a dime, and schools need to be ready to close again. So that is a little bit of a leftover from the first bill, but at the same time, it's schools need to know how to do this, because this probably isn't the last infectious disease thing that's going to happen to us.
And Ruby Reyes, hey, Ruby from Beja also had a question. Ruby, could you just clarify your question?
Sure. In Boston, we have only 34 of our 125 schools actually have HVAC systems. So I was just asking if it would cover costs of like actual implementation of real HVAC systems, or if it was just for repairs.
I think you can add an HVAC system, yes. The challenges, there's two challenges. One is you're using federal money, you have to use federal procurement rules, which have certain requirements on pay and competitive bidding. Also and you all probably know this, with capital projects, you end up having, there's often a timeline, you have to get all that. I'm not really a capital person, but there's a lot of legwork you have to do to get the contract set up. And I know, like Baltimore, I'm from DC, but Baltimore a few years back had to return a bunch of state money because they couldn't get contracts set up quickly enough. So if you're going to do capital projects, you should decide early and get it going now. You have until September 2024 to spend the American Rescue Plan money. So that's 3 years, but still, it's good to get it started right away.
Great. I don't see any more questions in the chat. And so, but I will say that we will have breakout groups at the end of the presentation where we can have deeper dives with the presenters today. And so if you definitely need more information on the rescue plan, Phyllis will be in that group. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Leah.
Well, actually, sorry, there are 2 more questions that have come in. So one note that Beth Glenn notes that community schools have already been deemed an evidence-based practice.
Yes.
And one sort of kind of random musing I was having as I thought about evidence-based practices, and Phyllis, when you just mentioned federal money requiring the federal procurement process is, and I don't know that this is necessarily for this group, but like the advocacy that needs to be done to make sure that there's equity in who actually gets those contracts. So that's just another thought that I was having. But yes, thank you, Beth, for noting that community schools have already been deemed an evidence-based practice.
And let me say about evidence-based practices, the education department has started a website to try to gather some evidence-based practices. And I know we at Future Ed are trying to put together handouts so that if you're like, I want to do summer learning, what's an evidence-based practice? We'll be having those out in the next month or so. So watch Future Ed's website. I'll also say the Annenberg Institute, which is at Brown University, is putting out a bunch of research-based sort of handouts on different things like social emotional learning, school climate. And those are really good resources if you're looking for ideas for what is evidence-based. And community schools is terrific. It checks so many boxes and there's great evidence for it.
I see 2 more questions slid in. So I'm going to go to yours, Keith. Could one make an argument to move resources to curricular teaching and learning improvements that are more culturally responsive and anti-racist as mitigation against the disproportionately negative impact COVID has had on communities and students of color? Or is this too much of a stretch?
Oh, I think you can easily make that argument. Yeah. I mean, one thing, one of the things I write a lot about school attendance. I used to work for a group called Attendance Works, and I still like to write about attendance. But one of the things that they show is like culturally relevant. One of the goals of the American Rescue Plan, among others, is to make sure kids are back and attending school regularly. You can easily make the argument. There's research that shows that culturally relevant curriculum, like the Ethnic Studies program in California, have led to better attendance and better achievement. So if you're addressing learning loss, it seems like that's a really easy argument to make. And with this education department, I think it's a slam dunk.
And then Kim asked a question about can the funding be used for bonuses?
I'll say yes, because a lot of people are using it for bonuses and some are using it for raises. I don't quite know how they make that argument, but I guess it could fall under that giving the principal what they need to deal with coronavirus, and retaining good teachers is what you need to deal with coronavirus and, you know, support learning loss. So yes, a lot of districts, a lot of districts and states, I think Florida is giving bonuses to all school staff. And I'll add too, sorry, I keep talking, but bonuses are probably a better idea than raises, in a sense that this is short-term money. It's going to run out in 3 years. You probably don't want to go hiring a bunch of people and giving people big raises, because you're going to have to figure out how to make that difference up. You're going to have a big fiscal cliff in 3 years. So things like one-time bonuses, starting new programs, investing in, like short-term workers, like the AmeriCorps workers, things like that, that can give you a boost when you need it, but not burden your budget 3 years down the road.
Wonderful. With that, now I will officially pass it over to Leah.
Thank you. And I am going to officially pass it over to Jasmine and Zakiyah. But again, want to just remind folks to put your questions and comments in the chat.
Thank you. So I'm going to start us off, and then I'll kick it to Zakiyah to take it over from there. I'm going to basically, thinking about what Phyllis just said, walk you through how this played out in New York, what happened here, and what we're doing about it now. So one, thinking about the 3 federal stimulus package. The CARES Act came out in 2020, around March 2020, when our state was in the middle of its budget crisis, when the pandemic was first hitting, and we had a huge budget deficit. As a result, 0 of the CARES Act dollars ever made the impact it was supposed to have. New York got $1.1 billion in CARES, and our governor cut state funding to education by $1.1 billion. Here we are a year later, and we're looking at the last 2 stimulus packages. So the December package and the American Rescue Plan. Both packages were actually included as part of our state's enacted budget in that passed in April of 2021. So districts kind of knew about what they were getting, but it wasn't materialized until, one, we knew that the state wasn't making cuts in state aid, and that the state actually put it on what we call the school aid runs, how much each district was getting, one in state aid, in the second or ESSER 2, and in the American Rescue Plan. So even though that second stimulus came out in December, our districts are just now getting to start spending it now. And you can go to the next slide. And so here we are with the American Rescue Plan, and what's happening here. And what happened is our state almost like took a bold initiative. And I want to say, people think New York is super progressive, but our governor was weaker than ever before. And our state legislature had way more power than ever before. So they took advantage of this moment to win big for education. In our state budget, it outlined that every school district must have a plan by July 1 to the state, and it has to be posted on the district's website. What our state also did was literally reiterated the parent engagement language again in our state budget. Literally, the quote here is in the state budget. Every school district must get public comments from parents, teachers, and other stakeholders on the plan, and take those comments into account in the development of the plan. It's just an added layer of accountability to have your state include that language to school districts. And then the other thing our state is requiring is that districts must break down the plans by the years. Remember, American Rescue Plan, we have 3 years to spend it. Our state is also asking for an extension to potentially spend the money over 4 years. And so our districts have to outline how they're spending the money over the next few years. what we feel like is it gives us a tight window to notify parents that the money is here, how much it is, how it can be used, and parents have the opportunity to weigh in. Having public and parent engagement language is something we've seen in the past, but just because it's required does not mean districts do it well. We've seen districts talk to a select few of parents and check that as a box of doing parent engagement. And so we wanted to make sure, one, that we did some parent engagement ourselves, and two, that we're holding the districts accountable to doing a thorough parent engagement process themselves. So I'll pass it to Zakiyah to talk about what we've been doing for accountability here in New York. And you can go to the next slide.
Hey y'all, so good to see so many of you. So you know, the first part of getting these dollars, I think the other piece that I want to add on that Jasmine didn't mention is that we got this historic win on the state budget that we have been fighting for about 30 years. We got this historic win of funds. If you've ever heard me talk over the years, you know I've been talking about the campaign for fiscal equity forever. So the collective we of New York State brought home those dollars, which is about collectively over the next 3 years, $4 billion total for New York State. So we got that. That was on top of these federal dollars. So New York State got a big windfall of about $13 billion total between the state win and the federal dollars. And so we knew right away that we wanted to make sure that we all were accountable for this process of these dollars, right? When we ever see this historic amount of money enter into our schools, specifically funding through Title I, which means a special population of young people, many of the young people we've been fighting for decades, all of us together, right? And so a week after we got the state budget was closed, we had already had on the books a meeting that we were going to have, accountability meeting with our leading champion, Robert Jackson, who actually was the lead plaintiff in the campaign for fiscal equity. So he come full circle from starting it off to bringing it home, right? And so and at the same time, we launched a survey at the event in both Spanish and English. And the goal there was to really engage parents and young people and educators in the conversation of what are these dollars, one, to explain what these dollars were so people had a sense, but also what do you want to see the dollars be spent on? And so we broke out into small groups. And we're still compiling this information. Right now we have about 1,000 surveys from across the state. And obviously the work, so having those town halls are really important, right? So to engage and to inform. People trust us as a longstanding organization around education. People trust what we say and what we bring to the table. And so it made sense for us to have these town halls to do this, right? We also had meetings with Central DOE staff, right? We just had one today, as well as with state education department. All those folks in local places, we are encouraging our leaders and parents to actually engage with their local school boards as budgets are being set right now. And a lot of it was around public education too, right? For folks to understand actually what these dollars are. Because I think it was Anika that put in there, said something like she spoke to someone and they were really cynical about the dollars. And we're we can't afford to have people cynical to not know what this is. This is not the moment for people to be I don't know. No, it's not enough. This is not the moment. So who better to be the advocates, as always, as parents and students and others around these dollars? So we wanted to make sure they had a clear understanding of that. And so we also had stayed informed. We continue to stay informed with our partners at Opportunity Institute on both the current and future federal dollars, right? So we need to stay ready so we don't have to get ready, because there's more money potentially coming down the pike, whether it's the infrastructure bill, whether it's Biden's commitment to fully funding or funding Title I at $45 billion. There's potentially more money coming down the pike. So how do we stay engaged, involved, so that we can then engage our parents and others in this process, in this fight? And then also, the work hasn't gotten any easier. It hasn't lessened. It is just different, right? We are working just as hard as we were before. I would challenge that this piece of this leg of the marathon, right? Because it took us 30 years to get those dollars. We had to it took a pandemic for somebody to truly invest in education, right? There's people in narrative that says it's too much money. Look all the money we throwing at. And I think Jasmine or someone else might have said, if we don't account for these dollars right now, they will blame our children once again. And we will have missed the opportunity to be transformative. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is get people to dream, be transformative, no boundaries, but while also holding those essential bodies of where these conversations are happening accountable. Do you know how much money we're getting? How are you spending those dollars, right? Who are you spending those dollars on, right? Are you engaging parents and young people in the conversation? As well as, are you assessing when you come up with these ideas, moving forward, are they working? And who are you assessing that process? How are you going through that process as well? So there's a lot more work to be done. And then lastly, I'll just say we also created an advocacy toolkit for parents to help them be advocates in their districts, because there's no way we can be everywhere, but the narrative and the understanding has to be as deep as we can and wide as we can go. And so we created a toolkit that really explains like the federal dollars and the state dollars. And if we find it, we'll put in the chat. This is the federal dollars and the state dollars, right? And what that is, and what are some of the steps you can do? Reach out to your superintendent, go to your school board meetings, like things like that, that really get people thinking about how do we organize ourselves to really hold folks accountable for these dollars. They are important, they're vital. And we need to know where we might need to do some more advocacy with some school board or an elected official or a body, an education department, because we'd be darned if we didn't fight 30 years for one thing, and it took a pandemic where we lost lives and children lost learning and all those things. This is not the moment to lose this opportunity. That is not AQE, that is not us. And that is why SHOT has brought us together. So let's collectively dream, transform education. We already have the stuff we want to make sure happens. It's always been about, we haven't had the money. Well, we got it now. So let's go.
So I wonder if we were going to do Q&A at the ends of the presentation, of both presentations, but I wonder if it makes sense to just, I was scanning to see if there were some questions specific to our AQE folks. So let me see, I thought I saw something.
There were a couple of questions, but I think they were more around the rescue plan, around parent engagement, and then whether or not this would be up for renewal.
Gotcha. Okay, one question I do have though is from what you all have already begun doing, right, with your the toolkit and surveys, like what information are you already starting to gather? Do you already have some info from parents and students? What's already coming into you?
I think the top two survey responses that people want are culturally responsive education and smaller class sizes. Those are the top ones that have been bubbling up for our parents. But the other part I do want to add is that we are not trying to do this by ourselves. Like Zakiyah said, we pulled together other coalition partners in the city who are the special education advocates that, you know, lead the fight, and ask them what their demands were. And let's put together a unified campaign, especially in a city like New York City. And so we've been also talking to other key stakeholders to make sure we're building the right comprehensive campaign or demands that hits on all of the things around students with disabilities, English language learners, technology, health, and protections for students. And so we're trying to be thorough and robust while also saying, like, we don't have to do everything as AQE. Let's lean on some others for their expertise.
Sorry, I'm trying to look in the chat and then also take my own notes. So Anika Whitfield from Grassroots, Arkansas does have a question that relates to this note that she put earlier about the cynical CFO. So as to quote, we don't have time for that cynicism or small thinking. So we got to gather this CFO real quick. So Anika wants to know, she said, our CFO indicates we don't have the money. We have to put up funds and wait for reimbursement and don't know how long that will take to get them back. What can I say to him? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so districts have a line of credit, right? Districts have a credit score. They are able to access fund. Lending to a school district is actually really safe because people know that they will get the money back. So yes, the district does have to spend upfront, but they will be fully reimbursed. And actually, we think the reimbursement process is going to happen quickly. Once the money is at the state level, or it's really at the disposable to districts and they have the access to it, those reimbursements will happen quickly. We are seeing the same thing too, different responses from districts. We have some who are meeting this with enthusiasm and taking off the shelf the plans we've kind of been working with them all along, and are like, we're hiring coaches and we're hiring culturally responsive restorative justice coaches and training, and they're thinking the way we're thinking. We have other districts who are so used to austerity that they don't know what to do. and they are pretending like they're still in austerity. And for that, we're going to push those districts where that the campaign there is going to look a little different. And then we have districts who we're worried are going to spend the money in the wrong way, right? That they're going to be like, safety means police officers, or safety means bulletproof glass, right? We need to make sure districts are making those wrong choices either. And so it is a gamut of like, what is your district doing? And based on who's there and what they're already, their inclination is how you build your campaign in response.
I would just add, I think, like this is the moment in those spaces, Anika, like to organize other folks around these dollars, like to have a clear, if you don't already have support on this, maybe it's from the union or somebody else to help you have a clear understanding of how much money you're actually talking about, and that people actually know what these dollars could go towards. That's enough. Often that's a lot of agitation for folks to push back against a narrative like that. And we know pressure works. One thing the system doesn't like is informed parents and community. And so the pushback, it's an opportunity to push back against that and actually hold up what Jasmine said at the same time.
And I'm going to jump in and add, I'm going to put in the chat, there is a website that has every school district and how much they should receive in all three of the bills. So if you don't know, you probably do, but if you don't know it, there's ways to find out. So I'll put it in the chat.
I'm now going to turn it to Son Bell, who is the Strategy Director for Californians for Justice.
Y'all can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Yeah, thank you, Jasmine and Zakiyah, for really breaking that down and breaking down what's happening in New York. So I'm gonna quickly share about what's happening over here in California. And I'm gonna give y'all a little bit of context. So in California, with the American Rescue Plan and the new stimulus dollars, we had a windfall of $35.7 billion. And a lot of that actually came from during the pandemic, many of the corporations, as we knew, made like buku money in terms of just like selling their, especially like Amazon and folks like that, made lots of money in California. And then all of a sudden, California had what was a surplus of funds, right? And so folks are scrambling, what do we do with this money? And our governor, who very similar to New York, right, sort of passes off as a progressive, but isn't really as progressive, made the directive to schools that they had to open by May 19th in order to get some of those surplus dollars. So you had a lot of schools that are racing currently, right, to open so they can access these surplus funds, right, and which are the funds from the state, separate from the federal pandemic. So what we're seeing here is that we have a lot of schools, a lot of school districts that are rushing to open because there is this perception that this is, in fact, a once in a lifetime opportunity. But the way that we're thinking about over here in California is that we've been on this tip over the last 20, 30 plus years that we know what it takes for our schools to get fully funded. And this is the closest that we have gotten. And so really, the goal here is not to only make sure that these funds really create structural changes, but that we make the case that our schools need to be fully funded and that we don't go back to the funding levels of the funding levels for our schools prior to the pandemic. So really quick, in terms of how we sort of pivoted in this moment, there was a lot of, in California, there's a lot of organizing infrastructure over the last 25 years that has allowed us to be very like nimble and quick to partner with each other across the state. And so we were able to do some action research and we polled 1,000 students, 87% of those students were students of color. And we interviewed at least 50 educators and administrators. And essentially what we found was that the 6 things that matter the most to students were, 1, a restorative restart. And basically what that is that, you know, with the rush to coming back to school, we recognize, and it's not just about students, it's about parents, it's about educators, it's about all of the line staff after school program, that we can't simply just like rush back to school and just be like, it's open, right? That we actually, students, school communities need the time to really restart, refresh, and like have the spaciousness to figure out what do the hybrid learners need, what do like parents need, and then also what is the game plan for the students that are missing, right? Because here in California, we have a lot of students that have not returned to school. The other 5 things that students identified were mental health and wellness. And this is something that is also shared with our teachers, the school staff as well, right? Adults are struggling with their mental health and wellness as they return to school. The other piece is student voice, making sure that in this return to school that students and their families and caretakers are a part of the process of what it looks like to create intentional community norms around like the return to schools, right? We know that we have like a lot of like elementary students who haven't played for like a year. And so how are you setting up and taking the time to set community agreements, right? How are we actually preparing the staff to respond in a way if a young person does end up playing or getting too close, right? How do you make sure that the staff is prepared to have a restorative approach and response versus a reactive response that sort of like shuns young people away, right? There was this question about the racial equity in curriculum and teaching. Can you leverage that? Yes, you can, right? And this was like actually like one of the top 2 things that came up for like our leaders was that they want to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. And this is something that we've been asking for a really, really long time. But the thing about the pandemic, it wasn't just the pandemic, it was the George Floyd protests. It was so many things, right? And so you have a lot of teachers and school staff, they're sort of like political consciousness converging in this moment of the pandemic and really wanting to make sure that our curriculum is like reflective of, of the student body, right? The one thing that I'll say about the racial equity in curriculum, like a lot of school districts are having audits, right? They're auditing the school curriculum. They're like, okay, we're gonna identify where things need to change. Where we, right, can really advocate and make sure to advocate for that to actually like happen is that we need to be asking the question of, well, are you resourcing the textbooks that accompany that curriculum, right? Because there's a lot of auditing, there's a lot of like, well, this is the curriculum, but then you don't have the text or the source, the source material to actually put that into place, right? And then last but not least, relationships between like students and staff. This was like the one of the top 2 that the students identified is that, many of their teachers, even on online learning, Zoom learning, it's really been hard to identify with them. It's been hard to make friends with their peers, right? And so how do we cultivate a space, right, where you feel like there's spaciousness, there's joy, and you feel like you really belong, right? Coming out of a pandemic, right, after everybody has sort of had to confront things, right, in their like daily personal lives, right, during this time while they're at home. So really quick, I want to highlight some key strategies that I thought were really important to name. At Californians for Justice, the way that we talk about our strategies, we bucket them into power of. So we have power of numbers, we have power of data and research, we have power of moral authority, which is about narrative and cultural strategy. We have power of relationships, right? It's like the sort of how we flex with like influencers. So power of numbers, making sure that Jasmine and Zakiyah really talked about this, tapping into the organizing infrastructure that exists within your schools, right? And sort of really your school communities, your city, your state, right? To make sure that folks are sort of like organizing around like a shared vision, right? Around what we want to see in our schools. On the district side of things, yes, there is a lot of cynicism. And I've been in like, some of these like superintendent advisory committee meetings. And, the folks on the ground, the pandemic is right in their face, right? And all they see are problems, right? There's like struggles, there's challenges, there's one thing, right? Oh my gosh, like our school forgot that we needed a breakfast program, right? Folks are really stressed out. And so it is really good to like take the time to create a space where folks have the spaciousness to be able to dream, right? To be able to sort of really talk about what are the solutions that we can move forward, right? Because as we all know, when shit is like really hard, it's really hard to like think of like a way out of it, right? In the thick of it. So, you know, creating space and advocating for like spaciousness, right, in our schools, right, the flexibility to be able to think about these solutions. Power of data and research, of course, survey polls, focus groups. The one thing that I really want to underscore is capturing bright spots and examples. This has really moved other districts who've been sort of cynical or like tight on their wallets, right? But if you can identify, if you have district partners or like teachers or other folks that you work closely with in the school community, and they've identified innovative solutions, and you share those solutions across the field, right? Those folks are more likely to sort of like move on things, right? When you show them like examples, concrete examples of doing that. Last two, key delegations with influencers. That's pretty straightforward. So making sure that the folks that move stuff, right? The folks that you are in really good relationship with, that you are tapping into those relationships. I think a part of our work, our Reimagine Rebuild campaign, we were just meeting with like influencers nonstop. And then of course, power, moral authority, you know, making sure that you are really being intentional about shifting the outside narrative, the noise that schools are getting. And this last piece that I really, really want to underscore, because it's been one of the key successes for us at Californians for Justice and other organizations in California, is vertical organizing. So really organizing, you know, from the ground up. So that's like the young people, like the parents, the teachers, and the school board members. Because when you have them all on the same page, it's hard for your district admin to say no, right? It's really hard. And so that's something that we've been really intentional about, is making sure that any of our demands and what we're calling for is that we are making sure that the teachers union is echoing the same message, and that they're in alignment, and that our school board members are as well. And then the last thing that I'll share is just like organizing a big tent, right? So one thing that we definitely made sure to do was to make sure that, you know, the research think tanks in California, the leading policy organizations in like California Teachers Union and the Administrators Union, that they were all aligned with what the vision of parents and students were for schools. And we got them to endorse. So now you see a wave of folks really sort of like carving out time to do the relationship building, to create the space, to really intentionally like reimagine and rebuild schools in the ways that that really meet the needs of the parents. And, you know, the last thing that I'll say is that, you know, a lot of our districts are really scrambling to figure out what is a really solid community engagement process. And I think that this is where like community organizations, our organizations can really step in and really show districts how to really engage in the community, right? Because we know that that's not necessarily their strength, and not something that they've done, right? And that they are being really forced to do, to reckon with in this particular moment. And I will stop there. Thank you, y'all.
Thank you so much, Son. I'm looking for questions specifically to you, but I'm seeing lots and lots of affirmations. And so I hope you have a chance to look at that, take a breath, and breathe that all in. It's just such amazing work that y'all have been doing. And it hasn't really been centered around this specific timeline for these federal dollars. This is, you know, long time organizing work that you all have been doing, and you're certainly using this moment to leverage that. So that's something I want to uplift there. We do have a few questions here. Maybe anyone from the group can take. And I just want to also share affirmations for everybody in this network has been so helpful to each other in the chat. There's a lot of expertise here, a lot of collective experience doing this work. And so definitely look into the chat when you have a chance, because there's resources being shared and ideas and thoughts and framing that may be helpful. So I want to go back to a question around parent engagement. Where does that show up in the, I believe that question is specific to the rescue plan and accountability around that. Where can accountability around that be leveraged? Then there's a question also around whether or not these dollars can be renewed, if this is just 3 years, or could it be renewed? And I believe there is one other question. I'm not seeing it right now, but I will take a look at that. So if anybody wants to answer to those two questions, that would be helpful.
I could speak slightly to parent engagement. Well, I'll say I don't know that there's any specific set aside for parent engagement, but that parent engagement, A, needs to be in development of the plans, but B, a lot of evidence-based practices you could use are and get involved parent engagement. I think a lot of districts this year are using home visiting, which has been something that's been shown to have academic and attendance benefits, but it's been essential this year to connect with families, get kids Wi-Fi devices, find kids who aren't showing up. And so I think a lot of the best practices are involved parent engagement. But if somebody knows more specifically, if there's a parent engagement provision, I don't know. And as for the renewable, that's a political question, and who knows where we'll be 3 years down the road.
Okay, just pausing to see if anybody wants to jump in on the parent engagement question.
This is Quasi at IEL, and I will jump in on family engagement. And I will say this to say, everything is geared toward accelerating learning. And so what we have been advising our partners in family engagement, particularly district leaders, is to say that you can't accelerate learning without engaging families. You can't address chronic absenteeism without engaging families. So any plan that wants to do any of those things has to engage families. And so we've got to flip the language, because it doesn't explicitly say, that you should spend the money on that specific strategy, but not only common sense, but research and practice throughout this last year shows that places that had good relationships with families did a better job responding to the pandemic. And you can't address chronic absenteeism. You can't find kids if you don't have relationships with families and kids and community, right? And you certainly can't accelerate learning if you can't find kids. So that's the way to really kind of flip it. And so then the question becomes, and so how are you going to engage families?
Right.
So the other added benefit is, now that the guidance has come out, we know how that goes, but at least the state guidance now requires stakeholder engagement of states and districts. And of course, those processes unfold in various ways, usually kind of quick and dirty, but that's another opening to kind of push the envelope. So how are you going to engage us? How are you going to get our feedback? You know what I'm saying? So it's really, as always, it's a very proactive strategy. If you wait for the states and the districts to get around to it, you'll miss the boat and money will be spent. So that's it. Sorry to be late, but
thank you.
Tracy, I just wanted to say something real quick. I think, the way I felt, like I didn't respond because that's not an option, right? For us in New York, that ain't an option. No, it's not written. Even if it's written, we going hard to get it out of that law, but it's not an option, right? And so I think, to Quasi's point, we always know that also includes young people, right? That's not something that's always, it must be, but our legislature did it very surprisingly, right? But it's a no-brainer when that is your constant, like that is part of your equation on everything equity. It is a no-brainer. And so I think, and I mean that for organizers and people who do the work, not the people on the other side, right? That is always an afterthought, like, oh, parents, oh yeah, let's add one or two, but for us, it's a no-brainer. And so it is always, the onus is like, organize your folks so you be the first ones in the space, like get people together so they understand what these dollars are, so they can actually go into that office and the people be amazed that they know anything, right? Like, yeah, we know how much money we get. We know how we want to spend these dollars. Here's our top 3, top 5 choices. Let's make it happen, right? Because we got a couple of hundred other parents, thousands of other parents out there who want the same thing, right? So it's always on us to make sure that the state or our local board of educations know that that's not an option.